I'm very excited to read for a few minutes from this book. I was like, oh, I'll read from like the new paperback, which I was like, it's very beautiful. And then I was like, no, it doesn't have any of my shitty notes in it. So I have to read from my own copy. Like I was like, oh shit, no, I have to read from my one that has all my stupid little scribbled notes in it. Also, if you hear any like, Alex, bless you for being here. If you hear any like weird like pitter patter around, the dog has decided right now that she wants to like run around and do a bunch of weird shit in the house. So bless you. I'll read really quick from the beginning of the book. Thank you everybody for coming, and thank you Books Are Magic for hosting the both of us. I wish I could be there in person, which I think Alex does too. It would be great, but it's so nice and lovely to be able to do an event where I still feel like I get to share drinks and writing with everybody because I miss people. Speaking of that, let me just like jump right into this book about gay taxidermy. Why don't I read from the beginning of it? How we slice the skin. Carefully, that's a given. Cutting with precision sounds like the same thing, but it's not. Consider the following. You've pared the flesh from a mango for a bowl of fruit salad. Have you done it thoughtfully, preserving the sweet yellow flesh, or have you done it with the clinical detachment of a surgeon? There's got to be some tenderness. There's got to be some love. Our father said this as he slid his knife into the coat of a white-tailed buck. It was unusual. He never let us close to the table while he worked. You gotta want it. He pointed to the throat, tapping lightly with the fingertip. Start below the cape, here, like you're unzipping a jacket. Milo and I crowded either side of the metal table as our father gently opened the body, his hands blue-gloved and steady as if delivering a baby. We were 9 and 10 and treated the shop with its creatures like our personal toy store. Other kids had stuffed animals. We had preserved skinks and mounted bass and antlers coated with barafane. Give me a little elbow room, guys. We each stepped back half a foot, then moved in close a few seconds later. The buck was large, but I'd seen bigger. The deer had already been drained of its blood and lay limp, limbs sprawled like a dismantled puppet. It was a 9-pointer, and the man who brought it to the shop was a regular, someone our father had over for beers in our living room. Buckets sat at our feet for any leftover innards the customers hadn't disposed of already, white plastic tubs that at one point housed pickles soaked in yellow brine. Some entrails we saved, some we didn't, but we always made sure the floor stayed clean. The smell of bleach saturated my cloud of dark hair, even when my mother braided it out of the way. My brother and I both wore old Publix bag boy aprons tied around our necks and backs in looping double knots. Though I was older by a year, Milo stood half a head taller than me, taller than anyone in the 4th grade. We leaned close to our father's elbows, trying to catch the knife's movements until he cleared his throat and we both moved back again. He wore a black rubber apron that he'd rinse off in the back sink, slicking off the intestinal remnants of our daily autopsies with lemon-scented dish detergent. Our mother'd wash ours and hang them in the front closet, next to muddy sneakers and raincoats and the mothballed sweaters we only wore once a year. Jessalyn held the neck steady. I moved to the front of the table and dug my hands into the fur, into the spine and tendons compressed beneath my fingers. I fought the urge to massage deeper, to let my hands crawl spider-like up the column and embrace the muzzle. Now come here, son, it's not gonna bite. From behind the deer's fuzzy cheek, I watched my brother take the knife from my father, a double-sided scalpel. On the table beside it sat the half moon of the fleshing blade he'd used to strip the wet hunks of flesh from the skin. Its curve caught the light, blinking silver into the fluorescent bulbs that lined the paneled ceiling. Like this, Milo clutched the knife like he would a sharpened stick, something to gouge and mutilate. He fidgeted and nearly dropped his grip as he dug down into the deer hide. Let me show you. Flex your wrist. Press steady, slow, not too deep. According to our father, customers wanted something commanding in the animal's pose. Most were hunters, and if they chose to have their kill mounted, they wanted it larger than life, as if the animal might reanimate an attack. They wanted bigger, stronger, more muscled. Our job was to grant that wish, even if the person shot the animal from behind as it nosed through a garbage can. Milo sweat through the neck of his shirt. It was cool in the back of our shop, low 60s to keep the inevitable rot at bay, but my brother looked like he'd just run in from the playground. I'm not sure. Like this? He pulled up the knife, jagged, moving too quickly. There was a purring tear. Sorry, sorry. Grunting, my father took my brother's hand and guided it back down to the work. I have to be prepared. You have to stitch it up after we tan so the lines won't show through crooked. Sorries wouldn't fix the coat. There'd always be a scar, something out of place to mimic the fat bullet hole behind its tufted ear. Ripped pelts weren't ideal, but there were ways to cover them. Mud flecked up on an ankle, or the fur combed over in a way that suggested muscle mass beneath the skin. I ran my thumbs down the buck's neck to the softest place at the heart of its throat. Its white hair grown in a clumped oval, framed by the thicker, slick stuff that coated its back. The dense coat that grew in for winter, even in Florida. My brother's blade slowed. They'd reached a blockage behind the back right leg. My father took the scalpel from my brother and squatted down to view the situation, lifting the carcass and turning it deftly. One hand pulled the skin taut while the other slid the knife below the lump that protruded beneath the fur. He quickly sliced the flesh and poked the knife beneath, flicking the tip upward until the mass was exposed. What is it? My brother's face was ashy gray. His lips, normally petal pink, so pink that boys from school joked that he wore lipstick, had thinned into a pale slit. Deer tumor. Our father carved up the lump until it began to separate from the fatty flesh and veins that surrounded it. Pretty good size, maybe 4 inches across. He hefted the mass in his hand, the vibrant blue of his glove clashing with the dark, clotted red of the tumor. He dug into it with the fleshing blade, testing the resistance of the growth. Hardly ever see any this big, mostly just warty stuff around the neck, sometimes the groin. Milo covered his mouth with both hands. A deep noise rumbled in his chest, the sound like gears grinding together, and then he turned and puked. We'd had tomato soup and grilled cheese an hour earlier. Most of it went in the big plastic bucket, but some of it splattered onto the concrete floor, with a few bits landing on our father's shoe. The buck's eyes were open, surfaces glazed and beginning to harden into wrinkles along the corners from where the water had leached. My brother continued to vomit into the bucket as our father stalked from the table. He brought wet rags from the corner sink, waited until Milo was done, still slumped over on the floor before thrusting one at him. Get the mop from your mother out front and clean all this up. The tumor sat on the metal table, my father's knife still stuck in it. He took the blade by the handle and pressed on either side of the mass with his fingers until it pulled free. Wiping it against the other rag, he turned and offered it to me. Overhead, the air conditioning hummed to life again. The breeze was cool against my neck as I took the knife. It was solid in my palm, the curvature of the handle fitting just inside the crease where my hand closed. He beckoned me around the table and I stood in front of him, contemplating the buck's substantial bulk. See there? He held my wrist, gently pointing the knife toward the open wound, now taking on oxygen and darkening. We'll have to work around that. Can you get below the leg and take the seam around the back? Okay, I'll stop there. That's good. That's a good amount to read. That's a good amount to read. Thank you for sitting and listening to me read through Zoom.
Oh, it's it's implantatory. As I was listening to you this time, I was thinking about how a taxidermist is sort of like it's a little bit like you're a courtesan for the hunter, like dressing up what they've killed, so that they can imagine the moment just before they killed it again and again. Like most of us, when we look at taxidermy, we're like, what is that random thing? Or ha ha ha, look at, or why would you have that, or but I would guess that most of us do not know this part of it, and I think that's one of the really fascinating things about bringing us in that way. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that illuminates this book.
It's I mean, it started off as a thing where, like, right, it's like that thing you were talking about where for most of us the taxidermy is the weird, especially sitting inside of Florida, right? Like, it's like, oh, it's this expectation of weird, expectation of like the bizarre. And I grew up around like a lot of taxidermy. Like there was just like taxidermy in places, like taxidermy at my church, like taxidermy, like you go to like a diner and there's taxidermy in it, or like at people's houses. And I think like
one question. What is the taxidermy that's in the church?
There were a lot of deer mounts at my church. I never thought about it as a weird thing until like later on. And I'm like, oh, I guess not everybody has that at their church. Like, that's probably super weird. Yeah, you just like not only have like the eyes of Jesus looking down on you, but also just like a dead deer, like just staring at you. But yeah, so it was a thing I was like, I kind of treated it as the bizarre, or this kind of idea of like something that is funny. Like, I think I was thinking about this a lot today, actually, where I was like, sometimes my entrance to writing is through the form of a joke, because something I think is funny, like maybe not a joke I'm making, but something that I think is funny, and I'm kind of sitting inside of it and thinking about how funny it is. And for me, taxidermy started off as like, it was funny to me. I was looking at very bad taxidermy and it was very funny to me. And I was like thinking so much about like, what does this look like if people are making the taxidermy? And through then like a copious amount of research, like how taxidermy works, like the actual logistics of making the dead come to life in this kind of way. I went on a lot of web forums where people were, like, who did taxidermy were like posting about
like a taxidermy Reddit.
Yeah, like it was stuff like, it was like these like really retro, like old school looking like chat forums where like people were like posting about like how they did taxidermy. And I sat inside one. I didn't participate because I didn't feel like it was mine to kind of like put my own voice into, but I wanted to see, and like I wanted to see how people were talking, because I was like, if I'm writing about it, I want the language to sound correct. I want it to sound like how people actually use like the vernacular of taxidermy. And so so many of the people in there like were like it's a very traditional kind of masculinity, people generally who do taxidermy. A specific kind of person, usually it's someone who hunts. It's people who have like practice with that. It's like a kind of taxidermy is like like a kind of masculinity. So it was like tips and tricks, but then it became this point where people would come back in and show the work that they'd made. And they would talk about it so tenderly, like, with care and very much with love, and or talk about it with a kind of passion. And I was like, this is a way that they're able to access art in a way that their traditional masculinity doesn't allow them to. But because it's something they've made through a kill, or like hunting's involved, or because it's in this space, they feel like they can talk about it in this kind of way because they've made something and they feel very passionately about it. And that not only they feel passionately about it, they care, and they treat it with love. And that was like where I felt like my impulse sat inside of taxidermy, because then taxidermy became much bigger for me. It became an idea about like, what does taxidermy encompass? Like, it feels like in the book for me, taxidermy, like intimacy is taxidermy. Like how we view like stories in a household as taxidermy. Like everything became something where it's like, you're trying to maintain and keep the dead thing. Like you're reanimating it to life through this kind of reimagining of how it can sit. So through like actually like creeping on people's like web forums, I feel like it gave me an insight into like maybe tenderness, into like, because also I'm very interested in the idea of like this like, right, because like so many things are in binaries, or in like this kind of thing, like ugly and beautiful, or like clean and dirty, or like these kinds of things where like
unreal.
Yeah, the most interesting stuff sits all messy in the middle. And that's like how taxidermy felt to me, like supremely messy, but also like a spot of beauty, and like a place where people could find like love within it. It became like a very tender thing.
There's a joke I'm trying really hard not to make, but
please do.
It's one of your jokes, basically like, is taxidermy ravioli?
Yes. Taxidermy is absolutely a ravioli. And thank you for saying that. Wow. That gave me intense joy right now.
So that's fascinating that you came to the subject that way. How did you find the narrator? Where did she come from?
Yeah, I think because before I had written this novel, I didn't consider myself to be a novelist. I hadn't ever, like, just because I'd never thought about my own writing that way. I love the form short fiction. And so sitting inside of short stories felt like not comfortable necessarily, but felt like where I wanted to sit. And this was the first time I wrote a short story, because I wrote it about a brother and sister who are taxidermying like a pet goat, like a beloved pet goat for a very close family friend, and they like fuck it up really bad. And so the short story was about this brother and sister, and it was about the goat, but it was much more like about like, oh, the dynamic between the two of them, and like what, you know, like what's fueling this, like how does this shop run? And I was like, it was the first time that I felt out, like I was thinking about it outside of the narrative of the snow globe of the short story, like outside of like the kind of contained world of the short story. I was thinking about it in this much broader, expansive sense. And to me, this character Jessa was like so much bigger than the thing I had made in the short story. So she became this like agent of like, what is it like when you're like so resistant to change? So this narrator was like, what does it look like when you feel like you're like, this is your one role in a household? Because like everyone in a household is like an unreliable narrator, right? Like it's like we're all telling the same story, but it's like told from different viewpoints, so everything's very different. They kind of converge and like touch, and then they separate. And so for me, this character became a person who's like feels like they're trying to hold a household together, but in reality, everybody's already living their own experience, and they just think they have control issues, and they're trying to like hold, like what grasp onto like memory, which is not a thing. So it started from this like space of like a person who felt too big to live in a short story, and became a person who, I don't know, like it was like really difficult to let go of them actually after I was done writing it, because I was like so engrossed not only with her life, but with the other people in the story. So like Jessa herself came from the idea of like, what is it when you think you're like in control, but in reality, you're like, control is not a thing that can actually occur. And you can't like, especially you can't control other people's lives, much less your own.
That's beautiful. The thing that I feel drawn to next is so having. So I don't think Jessa is a taxidermy, for example.
Yeah.
It feels like she just kind of grew into herself, took over the story. I think it's tempting because you are from Florida, and you know, it's tempting to kind of project her onto you, but it doesn't really seem like you and her share anything in common.
Yeah.
And I guess how hard was it to figure her out? Was it like meeting somebody who's introducing herself to you, like that kind of?
Yeah. I think the thing that was the most like the difficulty with her is because, I mean, pun intended, I feel like she plays the straight man like a lot of the time. Sorry, we'll make gay jokes here. She like doesn't get the joke a lot of the time, and as a person who like continually is just trying to make the joke over and over again, she's a person who I feel like is like never gets it, or like is like plays like this kind of role where she like doesn't see the humor in things, or like just can't. And so like a lot of the time she was the funniest thing to me writing it. Like, so it made it hard because she's not funny, and I always want to make a stupid joke, but she like, it became like she became the funniest part of that book to me, because I was like, it's so funny when someone can't see the joke and it's happening. Like, I mean, so much of the time, like in comedy or any kind of things like that, like it takes like the person making the joke or the things happening around it, but it takes like the person who doesn't get it to like kind of make it funny, or like revolve around it. And so like for me, a lot of the time that was her as a character. Another thing too was like, because people sometimes like would ask me like questions about like, well, how much of this is like you, like how much of this is like yourself in this book, like, and I'm like, well, it's a novel, so it's like, it's fiction. But I get that question. Yeah. Right. So like then the answer for me became like the most like me in the book is Florida, because I feel like the most Kristen Arnett inside of Mostly Dead Things is like my particular sense perspective of how I view place. So like when things are like sounds or smells or like a sensation happening, I was like, that's the most me. Maybe that's there, because I really wanted to embed this kind of sense of a feeling of place, because Florida feels so like actively alive to me, feels so much. And I think a thing that's been very weird is because I'm in Vegas now. I'm in Vegas at this like at Black Mountain Institute for that residency
Oh yeah.
fellowship. And this is the longest I've ever been outside of Florida. And now we're quarantined here, like in Vegas. But
I guess you get another fellowship.
yeah, I was like, y'all wanna like host me for longer? Black Mountain Institute, host me. But they, yeah, but it has been a thing where I was like, because I wondered how much of like, because writing this book and like this act of sitting inside it, or just us sitting inside of it, and it's like me, the lens of Florida, like so much of it has been like being away from it and missing it and thinking about it right now has been like, oh wow, like it's opened up how I think, even more so like how I think about home, or how I think about Florida, which is a place I want to write about. Like, what does it look like? What does it like smell like? What does it feel like? And also like, what are the things I miss when I'm not there? Because I've never had that kind of experience before now. I've never had the kind of experience of being like missing home, because I've just been home for like my whole life, like never leaving it. So like so much of like thinking about this book now has been like the nostalgia is like doubled. And then also thinking like how Jessa thinks of home, because maybe that's the other comparison, because it's like the me in the book is Florida, but also the me in the book is like Jessa is also like, I've been here my whole life, and I was like, that's also me. But that's many people in Florida, actually. There's like so many people who like born in Florida and just stay there. So
Do you think Vegas is going to make its way into your work?
I think so, yes, actually. I was like, there's so much here that's like, it's been like such a revelation to me to be here, because I was like, so much of Vegas reminds me of being in Orlando, because I'm like from Orlando, and Orlando, right, like it's a tourist destination. It's like people have an idea about what Orlando is based very much upon like it as a commodity and what it provides to people who are coming in to like utilize the space. And Vegas has that same kind of thing going for it, right? Like people come into Las Vegas as like a destination spot, and like, right, like people see Las Vegas as the Strip, or like the, you know, like there's like, and but then people who live here, like that's not actually what Vegas is like. And I'm like, wow, that's like so similar to like a feeling I have about living in Orlando, because when your home is a place where people come to like generate a very specific kind of cultivated memory, or like, right, like here's like the picture of when we went to like Disney World for like, and it's like that's not like actually what the space is. So Vegas has had like, especially talking to people who are from here, and like what it's like to like have people come and like visit your home and leave and feel like it as a destination, has been like, so it's made me homesick, because it feels so much like home, because that's like so much of like what it was like being in Orlando for me, was like, here's what it's actually like, but here's how people see us, and this is like the feeling of like what the space actually is. So yeah, also the weather is like, it's really hot, but it's so dry. I have like 3 humidifiers running right now. I keep getting nosebleeds. Oh, we're really getting into it now. I'm like talking about my own body.
So the book's been out a year.
Yeah.
You've got your copy all marked up.
Mm-hmm.
It's been quite a year for you, huh?
It's been an interesting year. It's been very, because I started off too, I was still working full time at the library I was working at when I was still editing mostly Dead Things, and then transitioned into kind of like just writing full time, and then moving here, and then like having a book tour, and then being like writing the next books for Riverhead and seeing like what that's going to look like. It's been a year of change, plus all of this other thing. Like there's a lot of going on. Everybody has a lot of stuff going on. Yeah.
You ever miss the library?
I do all the time. Yes. I mean, that's the thing about being like, great. I do. I mean, I do and I don't. I think there's like things because someone posted something on Twitter today and I responded to it and I was like, oh, I don't miss that. But like, because somebody was saying.
I was thinking about it because it was Cal Morgan.
And Robin.
That thing of like, how do you save your space in a book?
Yeah, like bookmarks.
And somebody was saying like, I don't believe that anyone needs a leaf. And you were like, wow.
Because it is truly like, I was like.
Bacon wrapper was the one that I was like, that you were.
Like an off the cuff reply too. Like if I had to sit and think of all the things. Because I was like, after I like tweeted that, because truly like, the things that people choose to use a bookmark is so fascinating. It's like endlessly fascinating in general, but like people forget and then they return the book and it's still in there. So Band-Aids, absolutely a bit empty bacon wrapper. Driver's license, social security card, plane tickets that hadn't been used yet. They still needed the plane tickets. So I had to call them and be like, your plane ticket's here. Oh God. Another book inside a book, like a small book used as like a bookmark, piece of paper that had peanut butter on it. Yeah, all kinds of shit. Like people don't like, because it's like, I think when you're like, I mean, not me, I'm not sticking a bacon wrapper in there, but I think like sometimes when people are into a book and they're like, right, like you have to shove a bookmark in, people a lot of the time are generally not like thoughtful about like, you know what, I'm just gonna slide a manufactured bookmark in here. They're like, what's around me? Okay, just slide that right in there. So people pick all kinds of crazy nonsense. But that was like part of like what I definitely miss about working at the library. There was this like definite slice of life I miss where it was like, it's like a constant like, it's the same thing I miss about being in bars where it's like you hear just nonsense conversations happening around you, people just talking and you're like, well, I can't believe a person just actually said that thing. Like when I was at a bar one time and a woman asked for peanut grigio and I was like, this just sounds like I made it up. But it was like that stuff happened in the library constantly because in the library people would come in and they would like forget that like you were there, because the idea of like, right, like the idea of a library is like the space, it's a community space, like it's there for like the people, so like for them to come in and utilize it in the ways that would be like the most beneficial to community. But so much of the time the people that work in a library are just like invisible to the people that come in. So like oftentimes you just hear so much wild bullshit. Like people like, I heard a woman one time on the phone, like before I left that job, saying like respect into the phone to her boyfriend. And I was just like, you can't hear this anywhere else. I feel like in a bar, maybe in the library. So yes, I miss it a lot. I definitely miss it because I feel like my dialogue benefited from being around people and just talking very freely.
Peanut Grigio sounds like a drag name for a drag queen in Orlando.
Peanut Grigio. Oh my God.
All right, so we're going to take some questions from the Q&A. I'm going to throw some out here for you. Oh, thank you, Erin. Joseph Cazalad, did you ever explain why Bryn, Milo's wife, and Jess's lover ran away? Kind of a spoiler. Whoops, sorry. I mean, did they run away? Anyway.
I mean, I think a big part of that book is because people ask me sometimes about like what I think like Bryn would be doing now or anything. And I was like, for me, like Bryn exists in Mostly Dead Things as a memory. Like the only times you get her in the book are through the lens of how Jessa decides to describe her. She's only ever in the past. So the ways that she's described, like she doesn't ever get her own voice. It's like very much about like how, because memory, right, memory is completely subjective. Memory is, it happens in the book in the way that I wanted memory to feel like for me, which is like you don't choose when you get to like experience it. Like a song can trigger it, a sound, a smell, some kind of thing, and then you're, shit, here's this memory, right? Especially if it involves another person. And memories are like so completely contained in how like we experience them, and they don't include necessarily the other person and like their perspective and how it is. So Bryn never gets to be like a voice in that. So like I think it's like unfair maybe for me to like discuss like maybe how like what, you know, like why she would choose to do something or what, or why she's not there, or like what she's doing now, because I think so much of it was like you only get this like ghost of her, and not even a ghost, but like the specter of like teenage love and like evolving into something. And that's like, or like memory, like nostalgia is like a drug, like a weird, like, and also like a weapon. I don't know. Nostalgia is like beautiful, but also very dangerous in lots of ways. So I don't know, like who knows what Bryn's doing? Bryn is living her best life. Who's to say?
So Charles Pryor has a fantastic question, which is, have you had any reaction from the taxidermy community?
Oh my God, this is a great question, and one that I can answer actually with relief, which is that like I've had people be like, wow, this seems authentic. Like you seem like you know taxidermy. And that was like, thank fucking God. I was so nervous about like what people, that was like the biggest stress for me, I think, was like, would people think this was like authentic taxidermy? And the only responses I've had have been positive, have been like, oh, this seems like very authentic and true to like the idea of taxidermy. Like people would ask me like, oh, you like, what have you taxidermy? Like people who taxidermy. And I was like, I have not. So I was like, the research is good. I did it. I did the work. But yeah, somebody who works for the Smithsonian was like, oh, we all had like a conversation going on and we all thought you taxidermied. And I was like, this is just the giantest compliment of my life. So the response has been good.
I love that it would be like a Smithsonian Slack about this book.
Yeah.
Gina Chung, were there any particular characters that you found challenging to write? And if so, how did you get around it, or how did you get through it?
Yeah. I guess like the character I didn't necessarily find challenging, but that I wanted to make sure that I was like really giving care to was Jess's mom. Because the idea of her and like creating art based on the taxidermy that was like, right, like that her daughter deems like pornographic art. I was like, I wanted to be very careful about how I like approached conversations with that, because I was like, so much of this like idea of identity in many households is like rooted up in like roles, like father, mother, son, daughter. Like children have, like parents have specific ideas about who their children can be, but I think children have very specific ideas also about who their parents are. And I wanted to be, I don't know, I wanted to be careful about how I thought about her mother being at this point, right? Like she's also grieving, and she's like a widow, and she's like, my whole life has been run around this taxidermy shop. What does it look like to deconstruct this and also build it up in this way that also very much like is centered around the way that I view my own sex and sexuality. And I wanted to be, so that like, that to me, I was like, I wanted to be the most mindful and careful about, because I didn't want it to be, look, you see my dog like just jumping around the couch in the background. I didn't want it to be a throwaway, because it started off as me being like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if someone's mom made taxidermy porn? And then it became this thing where I was like, I want to be like extremely careful about how I am thinking about women who are mothers also, but like are like, what do they get to have like outside of these kind of roles? And it became this thing I was like, it was difficult to write, in that I was like, I didn't want to fuck up. Yeah, so.
I think, let's see. Oh, Chaya, I really enjoy your observations on Twitter and wondered if, in addition to fiction, you'd consider writing a book of essays. Yeah. Have you thought about that?
Yeah. I mean, it is something I'm thinking about and like touching on. I think essays for me are different kind of work, and they feel, because I feel like when I write essays, it's because I have something that's bothering me, and I'm like, I have a question that I'm like trying to answer myself. And so like I sit and then I write the question 800 different ways until I figure out the right way to ask it. And then it's really me still asking the question. So I've been really thoughtful in thinking about putting together something like that, but it's a process I'm not familiar with. So I'm trying to think about what that would look like to put those together into like something that would be bigger than like one, because the way that essays work for me feels so much like unanswerable questions.
Yeah. I think they are like unanswerable questions, or they're like taking a rhetorical question and just answering it literally.
Yeah.
Like taking it at face value and being like, I will try to answer that question that seemingly we should not answer.
Yeah. It's not, like I said, I was thinking about it the other day, and I was like, so much of the time too, me writing an essay is because something's bothering me and I'm trying to figure out why something's bothering me, and then writing about it a million different ways to try and figure out the right way to ask myself, and then I still don't have an answer, and then it's like me putting it out there being like, does someone else have a response? Would you like to respond to this question? Ask it in a different way so I can figure out something. Like, it's like a lot. So anyway, yeah, we'll see. Maybe I'll poke something together, but Jesus, essays are like limitless, like unending questions forever and ever into the infinite.
They're also just terrible to write. It like
you would know.
At the end of an essay, you feel like you're dead. And the murder, you're like, who killed me? And the answer is you. You know. I was surprised that this book was not a library book. And I suppose that's my own desire for you to write one. I say surprised, by which I mean, like, I think I want you to write a library book. Would you ever? Or is the library too sacred as material?
No, actually, I mean, I think it's like another thing too, where it's like space from the actual physical place is maybe going to allow me to like, because I've been thinking about it more and more, like the longer I've been like absent from the actual building of it. Because so much of like library work is the actual day-to-day grind, right? Because like librarianship is like so much bigger than this idea of like just coming in for like 9 to 5 hours. It's like when I was working at the library, I was working like 60 plus weeks, like doing like stuff where it was like just being on constantly. And so much of it's like so physically based in the there that I think it never felt like a thing I could write about and like separated from it in this kind of way. And now that I'm like not there, this is missing of like the kind of thing I was talking about earlier, right? The actual like absurdity of some kind of things happening in the library, but also like distance enough that I think I could like spend time inside of it that doesn't feel like being like physically present. Like so much of, man, I mean, for a job that's like, I mean, every library application has on it, like you have to be able to lift a certain amount of pounds. Did you know that? It's like a thing. If you're applying for like a library job, it's like you have to be able to lift this amount of weight. Because it's like, which I think is funny because it's like you have to be able to shelve, but it's like, honestly, so much of it is like the physical weight of like being there, being in a library and doing library work is like requires like a physicality. And so like, and it takes like a lot from you, like mentally, the physicality of like working in a library. So I think being like absent from it has given me space to be like, oh shit, I think maybe I actually could be present enough to write about it now. So maybe so, Alex, maybe I will write some library work.
Are librarians secretly jacked? Is that the thing that
actually, I think you kind of have to be a little bit, there's like so much shit you have to do in a library. Like, okay, especially like in a public, I'm not even just a public library, but in public libraries, like when I was like working at the public library, I would have to set up for story times, and you have to set up like the tables yourself, those heavy ass like folding tables. And we would like just go in and like kick them up. Like you have to kick them up yourself. And I was just like, oh shit, this is a thing. Like that they don't put that on Yes, right. So like are secretly just super ripped.
I suspected as much. Okay, I'm gonna go back. There are a lot of, Christina Martini asks, there are a lot of very specific, purposeful, and graphic descriptions of a lot of things that are gritty and some might say a little gross, or maybe even a lot gross.
Yeah.
What would you say was the function of those descriptions? Was the purpose of that to make us uncomfortable, confront the difficult, gross parts of life, disconnect us from the characters in the way they felt disconnected from others? So many options.
Yes, there's a lot of things we could go here. I mean, I think for me is that I'm obsessed with bodies and also just the idea of how we choose to view them. Specifically, like, I'm thinking a lot about like female bodies, or like the idea of like, and what we consider, like I said this earlier, but like what we consider like unclean and clean, or gross and pretty, or like dirty and clean, or like just like, there's this like very specific binary that's not actual. And so much of like how like human bodies function is how we generally, when we think about them, like in terms of like the literary fiction, like the canon is like, oh, that's gross. But like, is it? Like, what's like the day-to-day like way that like we experience bodies? Like, people use the bathroom, people menstruate, like people like fart, like people like their bodies are like doing a lot of things, and to have it not be present because it's like, I don't know. So like the kind of like deconstruction of the body feels natural to me. It's the thing I'm most interested in, because I was like, it feels so, I don't know, it's just a thing that's like, that we all experience. It feels like the most human thing to experience, like living inside a body, right? Like, so for me, thinking about like, there's a lot of like gritty taxidermy stuff, but I also was like, I'm gonna put in like what it's like to like have sex with someone and have a period at the same time. I'm gonna put in what it's like to like, right? Because that's just something that fucking happens.
It just happens. It just happens.
Like, what is it like to be like, I haven't showered for, we're all in quarantine. I'm sorry. Is everyone showering every day? Bless you if you are. Like, what is it like to just have a body and have it smells, it's weird, oils and things come out of it. We like, just like our bodies are like, they're not these like clean things, they're things we clean. So, so for me, like writing in this kind of gritty way that like, was like examining the taxidermy, was like human bodies is like, we're doing the same kind of stuff. The same kind of stuff we're doing with the scraping and cleaning and refurbishing of the taxidermy is shit we do to our own bodies. So I was like, this just feels like natural to me. Also, sex is like the thing that's like, I don't know, there's lots of things that are great about sex, but like sex is like messy and like not clean and like a lot of times weird and can be very funny, or like a lot of things happening with it. And that's like something too, because it's like we're utilizing human bodies with it, and human bodies are just like, a lot of times we don't even know what we're doing with them. We've had them our whole lives and we don't know what we're doing with them. So yes, I'm the most interested. And so like, I think anything I write, and very especially in this book, I was like sitting inside of like, what does it look like to like think about the body and in terms of its functions. Love it. It's maybe, I mean, it's gross, but I love gross.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of like this panel I did last year with Garth Greenwell and Carmen Machado at AWP, and it was basically about like queerness and bodies in particular, and like thinking about queer embodiments basically. And we were talking about how there has been a kind of disembodiment that has crept into fiction that, I mean, I noticed it a few years ago when I was reading, I had this Iris Murdoch phase. It was like my hobby was reading Iris Murdoch novels, because there's so many it could take a long time to run out.
Yeah.
And she describes faces and hair so well.
Yeah.
And I was like, why doesn't anyone describe faces and hair anymore? So it was such a pleasure reading your book back when I got this. which the theme of green stayed
Yeah.
carried through. It was such a pleasure to have it be so visceral and physical.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it was important to me too. I wanted to feel like a touch or like a body.
Yeah. Are we at time? I'm looking at our post, or do we have time for one more question? What's our situation?
I think we have time for one more.
Okay, I'm going in.
I have to say, I'm just like in my own bar in my own house. I'm just answering.
Dom Guida. There's a Joy Williams story called Congress where the main character visits a museum of taxidermy and the animals are described as all being arranged in a state of extreme and hopeless awareness. This line reminds me of how taxidermy functions in your novel. It makes me think of how the dead are often placed in that precise arrangement of extreme and hopeless awareness. Was part of your research reading fiction that involves taxidermy?
First of all, it just gave me a thrill to hear Joy Williams and myself mentioned in the same sentence.
Indeed. Let's see. And do you think taxidermy is just the most daring example of this? Mm-hmm. And speaking about roles and identity, does taxidermy have an unstable role identity for you?
Mm-hmm. I do think there were a few books. I have to say, when I was writing it, I tried to, since I had never written a novel before, I had a little bit of anxiety if I could just even do one. I was like, this to me was like, I'm going to give myself this task to see if this turns into anything. Because I was like, I'm going to try and see if this book, I didn't even call it a book. I was like, I'm going to try and see if this story becomes a thing. And I was like, worst case scenario, it's a thing that I sat inside of for a while and I tried. And I was like, will this still be worthwhile to me? And I was like, yes. So I sat and tried to write it. And so when I was doing it, I did not read a lot of fiction that had taxidermy in it because I had a lot of anxiety about even being able to finish it. So I was like, I don't know. There was one book I read like immediately afterwards, which was Julia Elliott's wrote like Romy Futch, which was like by Tin House, like Tin House put that book out, which was a book about like weird taxidermy. And I was like, wow, Tin House book with like weird taxidermy in it. It's like great, because I think Julia Elliott is like an amazing writer. Her short fiction collection, which is called The Wilds, does this thing where it's like so clear. Yeah. The Wilds is so good. I was just rereading it actually like this past week because she writes in this like very interesting, because she's from South Carolina, and she writes in like Southern Gothic meets like the future, and they kind of like smash together, which is like super cool. Like she's got like robotics or like different kind of things like that, and with like, oh, here we are sitting like in like a very like specific kind of like noir like South Carolina, which is very cool. But like I read that afterwards, and I like read that book, and then I was just like, oh, my book is shitty. But like no, here's the thing too, is I think we're our own worst critics sometimes about our work. Yeah. Like I think we can be very harsh to ourselves. I'm speaking personally. I can be like very unkind to myself about like my work and what I'm doing. So I didn't read a lot of that. I love Joy Williams with a harsh passion. I love everything Joy Williams writes. Like one of my favorite things that she's ever written is like the Ice Skater, that story. It's like about like, it's about like the parents going, I just have to talk about it. I know that it's not about like the book at all. I just have to talk about the story because I love it so much. I sent it to everyone. I love Joy Williams so much. Like about like the parents who are sending their daughter to boarding school. It's the three of them. It's in 13 pages in this book, and it does more in 13 pages with 3 different specific narratives. Their daughter and the 2 parents, they have a daughter who's died, and so they're sending like their daughter off to like boarding school. And in 13 pages with 3 different people, it does more in 13 pages than I think most novels do in a whole book. So read Joy Williams. I didn't read that taxidermy story for it, but I think everybody should read Joy Williams.
Yeah. Someday I want to talk to you about State of Grace, her
Yes.
first novel.
Please. Yes.
Which is so, it's not like any of her other books.
Mm-hmm.
It's like she wrote it and turned into a completely different writer.
I just think she's so fucking talented. Like, she's just, I don't know, like nobody, I mean, she's like great, like she's such a short fiction writer, but she's just like so like the myriad ways in which she's like so good at like sitting inside of language. It's like ridiculous.
All right.